A man can spend 40 years letting the whole world believe he's small, and the only reason he does it is so that one day, when it actually matters, he can stand all the way up and watch the faces change. I've been small on purpose my whole life. Old truck, old boots, a house with a screen door that still slaps the frame the way it did when my boy was in diapers. And I let a smooth-talking man in a linen jacket call my son a nobody at a dinner table in front of 40 people, because I already knew something he didn't. Keep that in your back pocket while I tell you this, because everything I did after only makes sense once you understand that about me. Welcome to Dad's Bold Revenge. Pour yourself somethings, settle in, and remember, every person in this story had every opportunity in the world to act right. They just decided they were too good to bother. Do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe before we get going. You're going to want to be here for the end of this one. It was a Thursday in late September, down in Charleston, South Carolina. One of those mornings where the marsh smells like salt and pluff mud, and the light comes in low and gold off the Cooper River. I was out behind my place in Mount Pleasant, knees in the dirt, putting in fall greens I'd probably forget to water when my phone went off in my shirt pocket. The screen said Owen, my son, and the first thing I felt, God forgive me, wasn't worry. It was annoyance, because it was 9:50 on a workday, and that boy never called me before noon unless something was on fire. Hey bud, I said, you at work? Nothing. Just breathing. And not regular breathing either. The kind a grown man does when he's clamping down on something so it doesn't come out of him sideways. I've heard that breathing exactly twice before in my life. Once on the phone with my father the night my mother passed, and once from Owen himself the morning my Ruth left this earth. So my stomach was already dropping before he said a word. Dad. His voice came apart right on that one syllable. Can you come get me? I'm down by the Pitt Street Bridge, the old one. I was already pulling off my gloves. Don't you move, I'm coming. The Pitt Street Bridge isn't really a bridge anymore. It's a pier now, a long boardwalk that goes out over the marsh to nothing, where folks fish and watch the herons and let their dogs run. Owen and I used to throw a cast net off the end of it when he was little, back before everything cost what it costs now. That's where I found him, sitting on a bench with his shoulders rolled forward like there was a sandbag across the back of his neck. And next to him, my grandson, Jonah. 6 years old, sneakers that lit up red when he kicked his heels, a little backpack hugged against his chest like it might float away. Beside Owen's legs sat 2 duffel bags, stuffed full, the zippers straining. 2 bags. I didn't say a thing at first. I sat down on the other side of Jonah, put my arm around that little boy, and I looked out at the water for a slow count of 5. Just to get my own engine idling instead of redlining. Then I looked at my son. Why aren't you at work, Owen? He laughed. It wasn't a real one. It was that laugh that's just grief with nowhere else to go. I got let go this morning, let go. I kept it flat. From Caldwell Marine. 6 years he'd put into Caldwell Marine Supply over in North Charleston. Worked his way up from the loading dock to account manager. Walked in at 8, had a box on my desk by 8:30. HR didn't even look me in the eye. And the bags? I nodded at his feet. He rubbed the back of his neck. Wouldn't meet my eyes. Claire's dad came by the house last night. Bennett came to your house. He sat in my living room, Dad. Owen's jaw was working. Told me he'd had a long talk with the people at Caldwell. Said he golfs with the owner's brother. Said it was time I learned that a man's worth isn't decided by how hard he tries. It's decided by where he comes from. He stopped, swallowed. He told Claire that if she stayed under the same roof as me, he was done. Out of the will, out of her life, out of Jonah's life. Said our name didn't belong anywhere near his. The water kept sliding by underneath us. A heron lifted off the grass and folded itself back down 40 feet away. Jonah took a juice pouch out of his backpack, the kind you stab with a little straw, and started working on it like the world wasn't quietly coming apart around his head. Bennett Ashford, I said. My father-in-law. Owen's mouth twisted on the word. I sat with that a second. Bennett Ashford. Charleston royalty or so, he'd convinced himself. Coastal real estate. The man whose name was on half the new construction from Daniel Island down to Kiowa. The man who wore a different blazer to every charity gala and made sure the photographer got his good side. My son had married that man's daughter 4 years ago at a church on Trad Street, and from the very first handshake, Bennett looked at me the way you look at a man who's tracked mud into your foyer. Where's Claire now? I asked. At the house. She's a wreck. Owen finally looked at me, and his eyes were rimmed red and raw. She's not going anywhere, Dad. She told her father to his face she's not leaving me. But you don't know what that man's like when somebody tells him no. He'll come at me through her job, through her friends, through everything. And I sat there last night and I couldn't tell her it was going to be okay because I don't have a job and I don't have a plan and I don't have a single thing in this world that scares a man like Bennett Ashford, Grandpa. Jonah held up the empty juice pouch, very serious. It was the red kind. That's the good one. I looked down at that boy. He had Owen's cowlick and Ruth's chin and a face that hadn't yet learned the world could be unfair. That is the good one, partner, I said. You hang on to that knowledge. And then I stood up. Slow. The way I get up when my body's still catching up to a decision my mind already made 3 moves ago. Grab the bags, I said. Owen blinked. Dad, the bags, son. Grab 'em. I held my hand out to Jonah and he took it, and his fingers were sticky from the juice. We're not doing this on a bench by the marsh. Come on, where are we going? Get in the truck. He knew the voice. Every son alive knows that voice, the one that doesn't take a follow-up question. He grabbed both bags and didn't say another word. We drove north, up over the Ravenel Bridge, those big white cables flashing past the windows, the harbor spread out blue and wide below us. Owen kept glancing at me from the passenger seat, waiting for me to say something fatherly, something soft. So I turned on the radio instead. Found a station playing Merle Haggard. Fitting. Dad, he said after a while, you're kind of scaring me. Good, I said. Means you're paying attention. I drove us down off the bridge and through North Charleston, past the Navy Yard, past the truck depots and the steel yards, until I turned off onto a long private road behind a chain-link fence and a guard shack. The man in the shack waved at me before I even slowed down, lifted the arm for us. Owen sat up straight. Ahead of us, stretching out maybe 3 full blocks, sat a facility. Clean gray buildings, loading bays in a long row. Refrigerated trailers backed up to the docks, a tower of solar panels on the roof catching the morning. The sign over the main entrance was simple. Brushed steel letters, no flash. Harborline Distribution Group. Dad, Owen said, and his voice had gone strange. What is this place? I pulled into a spot near the front, the one that didn't have a name on it, because I never let them paint my name on it, and I cut the engine. Sat there for a second, looking up at 38 years of keeping my mouth shut. This, I said, is what I've been doing while everybody thought I was retired. I'll tell you what I told myself for 38 years, and you can decide if it makes me wise or makes me a fool, because I've gone back and forth on it plenty. My own daddy was a shrimper out of McClellanville, honest as the day is long and twice as worn out by sundown. He scraped and saved his whole life, and finally bought a second boat, and the minute the dock talk got around that Earl's boy's daddy had 2 boats now, the loans came calling, the cousins came calling, the church came calling, a man he'd known 30 years came calling about an opportunity, and inside of 3 years they'd peeled him down to nothing. He died owing money on a boat he'd already lost. I was 26 and I stood at his graveside and I made myself a promise. Whatever I built, nobody would ever know I'd built it. Because the second they know what you have, you stop being a person to them, and you start being a door they want to get through. So I built Quiet, started Harborline in 1987 with 1 cold storage warehouse and a single refrigerated truck, hauling seafood and produce for the restaurants downtown. And I grew it the way you grow anything that's going to last. Slow, in the dark, with your hands. Distribution contracts, then the warehouses, then the cold chain for half the grocery chains in the Low Country, then logistics, then real estate under the logistics, then the land the real estate sat on. By the time I was 60, I had pieces of this region most people drove past every single day without ever knowing whose name was on the deed. And I drove a 2011 pickup with 190,000 miles on it. I lived in the same brick ranch in Mount Pleasant I'd lived in since Owen was 3. I shopped the day-old bread. Not one neighbor, not one church friend, not even my own son, ever knew. Ruth knew. My wife knew into the shape of it, if not every number. She used to tease me about it in bed, called me her undercover millionaire, and I'd tell her it wasn't about the money. It was about never giving anybody the chance to do to our boy what they did to my daddy. She'd just shake her head and say, one day that boy's gonna need to know who he came from. And she was right. She usually was. She just didn't live to see the day I finally had to prove it. Because here's the thing Bennett Ashford never bothered to find out. The man looked at my truck and my boots and my calloused hands and decided he had me figured. Decided my son had married down. Decided our bloodline. That was the word that came back to me. When Owen told me Bennett said our name didn't belong near his. Decided we were nothing. And Bennett Ashford had no earthly idea that the biggest development of his career, the one he'd been bragging about at every gala for 2 years, a $140 million mixed-use waterfront project up in Park Circle that he'd staked his whole company on, sat on 26 acres of land that ran straight through parcels I'd quietly bought up a decade before he ever dreamed of building there. He didn't know that the refrigerated distribution hub his retail anchor tenant required, the one his financing was contingent on, was promised to come from a company called Harborline. He didn't know whose checks he'd been depending on. He called my bloodline unworthy while standing on my land. I just sat in that truck a second longer and let it settle. Get out, I told Owen. There's some people you need to meet. I walked him through the front doors and his mouth came open and didn't close for about a full minute. The lobby opens onto a glass wall that looks down over the main floor, and the main floor was alive. Forklifts moving in clean lines, 200 people in motion, the whole thing humming like a heart that had never once skipped. Owen turned in a slow circle, taking in the ceiling 30 feet up, the conveyor lines, the big LED board tracking shipments out to 4 states. A woman named Pearl from the receiving office came over and shook his hand and said, "Lord, you've got to be the boss's son. You've got his exact same scowl when you're thinking." Owen laughed for real that time, the first real one all day, and I felt something unknot a little in my chest. My operations manager met us at the bottom of the stairs. Otis Carrick. Big man out of Orangeburg. Been with me 19 years, knows every square foot of this place better than I do, and never once needed me to tell him when something was in motion. He took one look at my face and got quiet. "You want coffee first," he said, "or you want me to just brace up?" "Brace up," I said. "Pull me everything we've got on Ashford Coastal Development, the Park Circle project. Every parcel, every contract, every contingency." Otis didn't even blink. He just nodded the way a man nods when he's already 3 steps into figuring out the why. The waterfront thing. The big one. That's the one. We ended up in my office. Corner room, 2nd floor, glass on 2 sides looking down over the floor. A desk, 2 chairs, a whiteboard full of numbers that would have made Bennett Ashford reach for his blood pressure pills. And one framed photo on the corner of the desk. Owen, 9 years old, holding up a redfish off the Pitt Street pier, grinning like he'd hauled in a whale. I look at that picture every single morning. That morning it about took my legs out from under me. I sat Owen down and I poured him a coffee and I laid it out plain. What Harborline was, what it was worth, why I'd kept it in the dark. I watched his face go through about 6 different things at once. "This whole time," he finally said, "you drove that truck. Mom clipped coupons. I took out student loans, Dad. I took out loans. And you paid them back yourself, and that's exactly why I let you," I said. My voice came out rougher than I meant. "I needed you to become a man on your own steam, not on mine. I needed you to know that whatever you built, the husband you are, the daddy you are to that boy, you built it yourself and nobody handed it to you, and nobody could ever take it back and call it theirs. I watched what happened to my own father when people found out what he had, Owen. I was not going to let that happen to you. Whether I was right to do it that way, that's between me and your mother and the Lord, and I'll answer for it one day. But I never once stopped being proud of the man you turned into without knowing any of this." He sat there a long minute, looking at the photo of himself at 9. Then he set his jaw. "Okay," he said. "So why am I really here?" "That's my boy." I slid a folder across the desk. He opened it. I watched his eyes track down the first page, and I watched the exact second he understood what he was looking at. The header read Ashford Coastal Development, Park Circle Waterfront, and underneath it the parcel maps, the 26 acres, and laid over them, in plain surveyor's ink, the boundary lines of the land that belonged to me. "He's building on your property," Owen said slowly. "He's got options to lease 9 of those acres from a holding company. He thinks the holding company is some out-of-state investment trust. The holding company is me." I tapped the next page. "His financing's contingent on landing a grocery anchor tenant. That tenant won't sign without a guaranteed cold chain distribution partner inside 45 minutes of the site. There's exactly one outfit in this region that can do that contract at the volume they need." I let that sit. "You're sitting in it." Owen looked up at me, and the calm that came over his face right then, I've got to tell you, it impressed the hell out of me, because it was my Ruth's calm. The kind that gets very, very quiet right before it gets very, very clear. "So what do? We don't cancel a thing," I said. "We don't sue, we don't threaten, we don't raise our voices. We've got men working that project, Owen. Real people with mortgages. I'm not blowing up $140 million and hurting 200 families to settle a thing with one arrogant man. I leaned back, but that lease option of his comes up for renewal in 11 days. Standard 90-day renewal clause, and the distribution letter of intent his tenant's been waiting on. That's never gone out. It's been sitting on my desk for 2 months because I never had a reason to be in a hurry about it. I slid a third document across the desk. Until now. Owen picked it up. It was an offer letter. Director of Strategic Partnerships, Harborline Distribution Group, with a compensation number on it that made his old Caldwell Marine salary look like beer money. Dad, I've never run anything close to this. You ran the loading dock at Caldwell when you were 24, and the place was bleeding people, I said. You coached Bennett Ashford's nephew's rec league baseball team for 3 seasons. You re-shingled that man's pool house with your own 2 hands the summer his back went out. You showed up to every Sunday dinner that family ever threw, and you smiled while they treated you like the help. I leaned across the desk. You know how to show up, son. That's about 70% of leading anything. The other 30 I'll teach you my own self. He stared at that letter a long, long while. When Bennett goes to renew that lease, he said carefully, and finds out who he's renewing it from, he'll make some calls. And when his tenant comes asking about the distribution deal, he'll find out it routes through this building. Owen set the letter down, picked a pen up off my desk, and then? I almost smiled. Then, son, he's going to have to come in here and sit across a desk from you, and he's going to need something from us a whole lot more than we'll ever need a single thing from him. That was the most satisfying quiet I'd felt in 38 years of building in the dark. Owen signed the letter. The renewal notice and the distribution letter of intent went out together at 4:51 that Wednesday afternoon. I had Otis send them under the holding company's letterhead, clean and professional, nothing in them you could point to and call personal. Just business. Just the slow, polite machinery of a contract coming due. By Thursday morning I had 4 missed calls from a number I didn't have saved but recognized just fine. I let every one of them ride to voicemail. Bennett Ashford wasn't ready to talk to me yet. He needed to talk to my son first. And my son, for the first time in 3 days, was sleeping like a man with a foundation under him. Claire came by the warehouse that afternoon, my daughter-in-law. She walked in holding Jonah's hand, and her eyes were puffy and she'd clearly cried half the night, but her chin was up. She found me on the floor and she didn't bother with hello. My father called me 4 times this morning, she said. He's frantic. He keeps asking me what Owen knows about the Park Circle deal. Her voice cracked. I didn't even understand the question until Owen explained it to me an hour ago. I took her hands. You stood by my son, I said. When your daddy gave you a choice, and it was the hardest choice you've ever had to make, you stood by him. He's my husband. She said it simple, like it answered everything, because it did. I told my father he was wrong about Owen 4 years ago, and he didn't listen. I told him again last night. She wiped her face. I don't want my father's money, Mr. Markham. I never did. But her voice caught. He's still my dad, and he's Jonah's grandfather, and I don't know how to want both of those things at once. You don't have to figure that out today, I told her. Whatever happens between you and your father, that's yours to work out, in your own time, with the good Lord's help. Owen and I are only handling the business piece. We're not touching the rest of it. That's not ours to touch. She looked at me a long second. Then she hugged me, hard, and Jonah wrapped himself around both our legs, because he didn't want to be left out. And I stood there in the middle of my own loading floor, with my arms full of the 2 people Bennett Ashford had thrown out on a bench, and I thought, all right then, all right. Bennett walked into Harborline at 2 p.m. on Friday. Exactly 4 days after he sat in my son's living room, and told him his name didn't belong anywhere near his. I was down on the floor when he came through the lobby, and I watched him on the monitor at Otis's station. Charcoal suit, silver hair, that walk he had like the floor ought to be grateful he was on it. But there was something underneath it now, a man recalculating with every step. I didn't go up to that meeting. I want you to understand that. I never went into the room. I stood in the hallway outside Owen's office. We'd moved my son into a real office that morning, glass walls, the production floor humming below it like a pulse, and I stood just out of sight, close enough to hear, far enough to let my boy have his room. Owen was standing when Bennett came in, not sitting behind the desk trying to look big. Standing, relaxed, jacket on, hands loose at his sides, looked like he'd worked there his whole life. Bennett stopped in the doorway. I counted the silence. 1, 2, 3, 4 seconds. Owen, careful, measured. Bennett. My son gestured at the chair. Appreciate you coming in. Have a seat. I heard the chair move, heard Bennett start in with the voice, the smooth one, the boardroom one, the one that had talked its way out of 100 tight corners. I think there's been a misunderstanding about the lease renewal, and this letter your group sent my anchor tenant. We've been good partners to whoever owns this operation for years now, and I'm sure if we sit down like reasonable men and walk through the numbers. There's no misunderstanding, Owen said. Not loud, not sharp, just done. The lease renewal is standard procedure. The terms are in the option agreement you signed. The distribution letter of intent is standard too. It went out because the timeline came due. That's all. A pause. Owen, I understand things are complicated right now between our families. There's emotion involved, and I respect that. But business is business. We shouldn't let personal feelings cloud what's been a productive arrangement. You're right, Owen said. Business is business. I could hear Bennett shift, surprised at the agreement, which is why I want to be completely professional about what comes next. My son went on, and I heard the quiet slide of a folder across the desk. We've had our people draft a revised partnership agreement, new lease terms, new distribution structure, fair market rate, real delivery benchmarks, standard clauses, nothing punitive, nothing personal. There was a long quiet while Bennett read. I could picture it. The silver-haired man in the linen soft suit, 4 years of comfortable assumptions dissolving one line at a time, in a document prepared by the son-in-law he'd called unworthy 4 days back. These terms, Bennett said finally, and his voice had changed. These terms are reasonable. I know, Owen said. I wrote them to be. More silence. And then Bennett's voice did something I did not expect. It dropped. Not the boardroom drop, the soft one a man uses to reframe, a real one. The sound of a man whose grip is finally giving out on something he's carried too long. Owen, what I said. At my house. About your family, about he stopped on the word. Couldn't get it out the second time. I was out of line. I've been out of line about a lot of things for a long time, and I told myself it was standards. It wasn't standards. I don't know what it was. A breath, I'm sorry. For real. Not because of any of this paperwork. I'd have owed you that apology if you'd walked in here with nothing. The hallway went very still around me. Because in 12 years of knowing that man, across every dinner and holiday and wedding toast, I had never once heard Bennett Ashford apologize for a thing in his life. And he didn't even know I was standing 15 feet away to hear the first time he ever did. Owen let it sit. He didn't pounce on it, didn't wave it off, didn't hand the man cheap forgiveness to make the moment less heavy. He just let Bennett breathe inside his own honesty for a second. Which, if you ask me, was more grace than the man had coming, and more steadiness than most fellows half his age could have managed. I appreciate you saying that, Owen said at last. Warm, but not soft. I do, and I'll tell you the same thing my father would tell you. Whatever happens between you and Claire, that's between you and her and God. Jonah needs his grandfather. I'm not standing in the way of that, and I never would. But that part isn't mine to negotiate, and it's not on this desk. No, Bennett said quietly. It's not. But I need you to hear one thing, Owen said, and his voice dropped to that low register that fills a room better than any shout ever could. Not as a business partner, not as your son-in-law, man to man. I stopped breathing in that hallway. My father built this, Owen said, 38 years, in silence, without asking one soul for their approval or their permission. He built it so that on the day somebody decided his family wasn't good enough, his family would have somewhere solid to stand. You looked at us and you saw people who didn't belong at your table. You made a phone call that cost me my job. You tried to take my son's mother away from him. A beat. And you ended up sitting across this desk from me, in a building my father owns, signing a contract that decides whether your life's biggest project survives the year. Nobody in that room moved. I could hear the production floor humming 3 stories down. My dad taught me that real power doesn't have to embarrass anybody, Owen said. It just makes things clear. And then I heard it, the quiet, unmistakable scratch of a pen moving across paper. Bennett Ashford signed. Owen signed under him, calm and unhurried, the way a man signs a thing he decided on days ago. Nobody made a speech. Nobody twisted the knife. Nobody said another word about whose name belonged near whose. They didn't need to. Everybody in that room already knew exactly how it had gone. I didn't go in. I walked down the stairs, out across the floor, past the forklifts and the men I pay, and the work that keeps 200 families fed, and I went and stood out in the parking lot next to my 11-year-old truck. I looked up at a Carolina sky going soft and pink over the harbor, and I stood there a long, quiet while. 38 years. And I'll tell you the truth, not one day of it was ever about revenge. Not really. It was about my daddy dying broke on a dock because people found out what he had. It was about a promise I made a 26-year-old kid at a graveside. It was about building something so deep in the ground that when the storm finally came rolling in for the people I love, they'd have a place to plant their feet and not be moved. I thought about my father, pressing his last folded bills into my hand with his whole heart in his eyes. I thought about Owen at 9, holding up that redfish off the Pitt Street pier, grinning like he'd conquered the ocean. I thought about Jonah in the back seat of my truck, telling me the red juice was the good kind, dead serious, like it was the most important thing he'd ever need to teach me. Bloodline. Bennett Ashford had called ours unworthy. This was our bloodline. A man who built in the dark so nobody could take it. A son who showed up every single time, without flinching, even when they treated him like furniture. A little boy in light-up sneakers who didn't know yet what was being kept safe for him, but who'd spend his whole life standing inside the proof of it. There isn't a contract written that can measure that. There isn't a linen jacket or a silver head of hair or $140 million that comes close. A week later, Owen and Claire and Jonah came over for Sunday supper, and Bennett came too, quiet, careful, holding a casserole dish like a peace offering he wasn't sure would be accepted. He sat at my table. He helped Jonah cut his chicken. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. Some things you say with a pen, and some things you say by just showing up to a table you used to think you were too good for. Claire watched her father and her husband pass the sweet tea back and forth like nothing had ever broken, and she squeezed my hand under the table, and I squeezed it back. I got in my truck that night after they'd gone, and I drove home down the same roads I'd driven for 38 years. Old engine. Same screen door waiting to slap the frame behind me. I turned on Merle Haggard and I rolled my window down to the marsh air, and I drove home through my own city, past my own land that nobody knew was mine, quiet and complete and entirely undefeated.